What would you do if the very person who worked tirelessly to keep your home clean and safe was left standing outside in the pouring rain, locked out, shivering, and humiliated by the man she served every single day? Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly simply because of their position or their lack of wealth? What you're about to discover now may surprise you, because behind the polished walls of a wealthy man's mansion, one stormy night revealed more about his heart and his child's innocence than years of riches ever could. Stay with me until the end, because this story is not just about power and arrogance, but about the kind of compassion that can pierce through even the coldest exterior. The rain fell in heavy sheets across the quiet neighborhood of an American suburb, where wide streets and towering iron gates usually kept the outside world at a distance. Inside one of those gates stood a mansion so large it seemed untouchable, glowing lights spilling from its windows, laughter echoing from within. But at the very doorstep of that mansion, soaked and trembling, stood Mary, the maid. She had worked for Richard, the millionaire, for years, and yet, on that night, her loyalty and humanity were rewarded not with warmth or shelter, but with cruelty. Richard, dressed in a tailored suit, had looked her in the eye and told her to wait outside until the storm passed. To him, she was not a person deserving of comfort. She was just the help. Imagine that moment. The smell of wet earth rising with the storm, the sound of thunder rattling the sky, and a woman left alone under the unforgiving downpour, while only a few feet away a golden chandelier illuminated a dining room filled with warmth, wine, and conversation. Have you ever felt the sting of being overlooked, as if your dignity didn't matter? That's the humiliation Mary faced. A humiliation meant to keep her in her place, while Richard believed his wealth gave him the right to decide who was worthy of kindness. But what Richard did not expect was that his own child, Ethan, was watching. Ethan, no older than 10, had been raised in privilege, but unlike his father, he carried a heart untouched by arrogance. Children often see what adults ignore. They notice suffering, they sense injustice, and sometimes they are the only ones willing to speak the truth when others stay silent. And on that stormy night, Ethan saw the maid outside, her hair dripping, her hands trembling as she hugged herself against the cold. Something inside him stirred, a mix of confusion and compassion. "Why is she outside, Dad?" he might have asked, his small voice breaking through the clinking of silverware and shallow laughter inside the dining hall. But Richard brushed it off, dismissing his son's concern. To him, appearances mattered more than humanity. Allowing the maid to step inside during dinner would, in his mind, ruin the perfect image he wanted to project. This is where the story begins to shift, because when innocence collides with arrogance, something powerful happens. Ethan's curiosity and kindness would soon clash with Richard's pride, and in that confrontation, the truth about both father and son would be revealed. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the youngest among us carry the greatest wisdom? Ethan's small act of defiance would not only challenge his father, but expose him in front of others, showing that true wealth isn't measured by money or status, but by the courage to treat people with dignity, even when no one is watching. And so, as the storm raged louder outside, the stage was set for a lesson no amount of riches could buy. Richard believed his power could silence compassion, but what came next would leave him speechless and change everything. And maybe this is the part where I need to pause for a moment and talk directly to you, because what we're exploring here isn't just a story, it's something that touches all of us in one way or another. Have you ever been in Mary's place, feeling invisible when all you needed was a little kindness? Or maybe you've seen someone like Ethan, someone young, pure, unafraid, stand up for what's right when everyone else looked away. If this stirred something inside you, I'd love to hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice adds another layer to this conversation. And while you're here, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, if you believe more people need to reflect on compassion, dignity, and the value of simple human decency, then let's walk this journey together. Hit the like button. It might seem small, but it tells me this message reached you. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, the next reminder that even in a world full of wealth and arrogance, the smallest act of kindness can still shine through. Your participation is what keeps this channel alive, what helps these messages reach people who may need them right now, but don't even know it. Yet, this isn't just about numbers, it's about building a community that believes in something deeper than appearances. So stay with me, because the story doesn't end here. The storm is still raging, and what happens next inside that mansion will challenge everything Richard thought he knew about power, pride, and love. The storm pressed harder against the mansion's tall windows, rattling the glass like a warning from nature itself. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the smell of roasted meat and polished wood, yet a different kind of chill spread through the room, a silence that wasn't caused by the weather, but by the weight of unspoken truth. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on Mary, her thin jacket plastered to her skin, raindrops sliding down her face, as if they were tears the sky itself cried on her behalf. For a boy his age, it wasn't a calculated decision. It was instinct, the purest form of compassion, the kind that doesn't pause to weigh social rules or appearances. He reached for the door handle, and before Richard could react, the heavy oak door creaked open, letting in a rush of cold air mixed with the scent of wet earth. "Mary, come inside," Ethan's voice cut through the quiet, soft but unwavering. Richard's fork clinked against his plate. The sound was sharper than the thunder outside. His jaw tightened, his authority suddenly questioned, not by a business rival, not by a board member, but by his own son. The guests glanced at one another, uncomfortable, some pretending not to notice, while others leaned in, eager to witness the unfolding confrontation. For them, this was no longer just dinner. It was a revelation of character, a behind-the-scenes moment where a man's carefully curated image began to fracture. Mary hesitated, glancing at Richard. Her instinct told her not to move, not to cross a line she knew her employer had drawn. But the boy's eyes carried something she hadn't seen in years: sincerity without agenda. She stepped forward hesitantly, her shoes squeaking on the marble floor, and in that simple act, the contrast between innocence and arrogance became impossible to ignore. Richard's voice finally broke the tension. "Ethan, shut the door. She'll dry off outside. This is not her place." But the child stood firm, his small frame blocking the gap between the storm and the lavish dining room. "Dad, she's freezing. Why can't she sit down for a minute? Why can't she be warm too?" His words, unpolished and raw, carried more weight than the expensive chandelier above their heads. The guests shifted again, whispering behind napkins. For years, Richard had been the authority in every room, his money, his sharp tongue, his calculated decisions making him untouchable. Yet here, in his own home, his authority crumbled in front of a child's simple truth. The hidden truth was now visible to everyone. Compassion couldn't be bought, and cruelty couldn't be disguised by wealth. This was the impact Richard never expected. His empire, his mindset of control and dominance had been built on the belief that power flowed only from money and fear. But Ethan's small rebellion chipped away at that foundation, revealing cracks that had always been there, hidden beneath arrogance. In a single moment, the millionaire wasn't the master of his household. He was exposed as a man afraid of losing face, afraid of what kindness might say about his control. Mary, still dripping, whispered almost apologetically, "It's all right, Ethan. I'll wait." Outside, her humility wasn't weakness. It was the survival instinct of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to endure injustice without complaint. But Ethan shook his head. "No, it's not all right." His voice wavered slightly, but it carried an undeniable conviction. And those words, spoken by a child in front of adults who prided themselves on status and authority, landed heavier than any thunderclap. Narration drifted across the room like the echo of something eternal. How often do we silence the voices of the innocent, only to realize they were the ones holding the key to transformation? Ethan's decision wasn't just about letting Mary inside. It was about rewriting the unspoken rules of that house, rules built on superiority, fear, and appearances. The guests couldn't unsee what had just unfolded. Behind the polished laughter and luxury, they glimpsed the heart of a family shaped by decisions that revealed more than the richest business deal ever could. It was no longer about wealth. It was about humanity. And in that moment, Ethan had more authority than his father. Richard's mind raced, his pride battling the sting of humiliation. He knew the impact this scene had on his image. Every eye at the table had witnessed it. And he also knew whispers would leave his mansion along with the guests that night. For a man like Richard, reputation was everything. But what happens when reputation collides with truth? When the carefully built facade crumbles under the weight of a child's compassion? Mary sat hesitantly at the edge of a chair Ethan pulled out for her, her wet clothes staining the fabric, her presence both awkward and powerful. No one laughed now. No one dared break the silence. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if the world itself held its breath. And here lies the contradiction that would define Richard's journey. He had all the money, all the control, but not even his fortune could erase the shame of being corrected by his own son. What Ethan had done wasn't just defiance, it was revelation, a moment where the hidden truth surfaced and the unspoken power dynamics flipped upside down. "Ethan," Richard finally muttered, trying to regain control, "you don't understand how the world works." But the boy, still standing beside Mary, answered with words that pierced deeper than he could imagine. "Maybe it's you who doesn't understand, Dad." The simplicity of that sentence was devastating. The guests froze, their forks suspended in mid-air, their eyes darting between father and son. It wasn't just an argument anymore. It was a mirror held up to every person at the table, forcing them to confront the question, do wealth and status excuse cruelty, or is dignity something no storm should ever take away? This was more than a clash between father and child. It was the unfolding of a hidden drama, a behind-the-scenes revelation that money couldn't cover up. And as Richard sat there, fighting to maintain his composure, he didn't realize that this was the beginning of a transformation he could no longer control. The mansion, once a symbol of untouchable power, now carried the weight of something far greater, the undeniable truth that sometimes the smallest voices hold the greatest strength. And as the storm outside continued its relentless pounding, the echoes inside those walls grew stronger, setting the stage for what no one in that room would ever forget. Thunder braided itself through the clouds like steel cables, and inside the mansion the room felt staged, as if every glass, every silver fork, every laugh had been placed with tweezers to communicate control. Yet the person who had arranged that perfection stood outside a moment ago, soaked and patient, waiting for permission that should have been automatic in a nation built on the idea that every person carries dignity. This is where the introductions truly matter, not as a list of names, but as the living fabric that explains how a night like this becomes a turning point. Richard sat at the head of the table, not because the chair was larger, but because his life had trained him to believe leadership was a spotlight. He grew up in Ohio, the son of a mechanic and a cashier, and sometime between a paper route and his first sales job, he decided that respect was something you took, not something you earned. He learned fast, spoke faster, built a tech logistics company that now moved things across the country before people even realized they needed them. He admired speed, margins, and decisive action. In boardrooms, he cut to the chase. In kitchens, he wanted things done yesterday. In his mind, success was a scoreboard, and empathy was a timeout nobody had time for. You can call it mindset, but for Richard, it was more like armor. He wore it everywhere, through investor calls, charity galas, even his own living room, because armor had gotten him out of the small house, the shared car, the thick winter coats from the thrift store. "I make decisions," he liked to say, and he said it often to anyone who took longer than 3 seconds to answer a question. That's why I'm in this seat. And yet, on this night, that sentence felt smaller than the reality around him. Mary learned a different language of life, her childhood unspooled on the fringes of a Midwestern town where you shook hands with complications every morning. She learned to read faces before they spoke, to hear tension through walls, to carry responsibility like a second coat. People imagine humility is soft, but in Mary it was forged. She turned up early, left last, and never let a complaint slip from her lips because complaints never paid a bill or cooled a fever. She could polish a banister until it reflected a person's better self. She saw behind-the-scenes details others walked right past. The tile that chipped near the pantry, the draught under the breakfast nook, the chipped coffee mug Richard preferred because it fit his hand. Work is work, she would remind herself, towel on her shoulder, hair tied back, and the small things matter. If anyone had asked, she would have told them the house breathed differently on rainy days. The wood seemed to swell with secrets. She had her own quiet rituals of endurance, counting her steps between tasks, whispering a line of a hymn under her breath before a long day, closing her eyes for 2 seconds before knocking on doors. She cared about dignity like some people care about interest rates. And when Richard told her to wait outside, part of her was hurt, yes, but part of her also recognized something familiar, the hidden truth that power, once afraid, becomes unkind. It's fine, she could tell herself. I've stood in worse weather. But the water trailing from her sleeves, the thunder shivering the windows, and the heavy stare of the front door said otherwise. Ethan did not learn the world through profit and loss. He learned it through pets and teachers and rain puddles that turned the car driveway into a map of lakes. He was 10 and endlessly curious, with a backpack full of trading cards and a head full of questions that seemed to arrive like unannounced guests. He liked stories where the ordinary kid made the brave choice. He did not know much about supply chains, but he understood that when a person is cold, you give them warmth. When a person is hurt, you look them in the eyes. When a person is locked outside, you open the door. His life had given him many things: piano, lessons, summer baseball, birthday parties with organized goodie bags, but it had not yet taught him to ignore pain. He looked at Mary and saw a person, not a role. He looked at the rain and saw an instruction, not an obstacle. And when he touched the door and felt the chill run through his arm, it was less a decision than a reflex. "Mary, come inside," he said, and each syllable sounded like it had been waiting all day for a moment to matter. Richard's guests were Americans in the way social circles orbit success. A hospital donor, a venture partner, a neighbor who always managed to arrive when the photographer did. They admired Richard's journey, the transformation from small-town grit to gated driveway certainty, because it told them their own decisions had been wise. Sitting there between the wine and the wagers about a new stock listing, they watched father and son like audiences watch a tightrope act. Some cheered silently for power to assert itself because they believed order was safety. Some found themselves rooting for the boy because somewhere inside they remembered the last time they failed to speak. Most felt the quiet impact of a truth they couldn't say out loud. This house had been held together by labor they did not see. Mary's hands knew every hinge and shadow, and without her, the stage would not have been set for their admiration. That, too, is a hidden truth. The more pristine the scene, the more invisible the workers who make it so. Richard's face tightened as a man who had mastered markets realized he could not master the moment. "Ethan," he said with a voice that had concluded negotiations, "close the door. Now." He wasn't shouting. He never needed to. Authority lived in his certainty, but certainty trembled when Ethan didn't move. "Dad," the boy said, "she's soaked, please." It landed gently, but it landed. Sometimes there's a seam in a person's armor, a stitch they forgot to reinforce because it looked insignificant. Ethan had found it Mary stepped across the threshold like someone stepping into both danger and relief, a journey measured in inches. She dripped on the marble, and each drop felt like a rebuttal to the idea that place and worth are the same thing. "I'm sorry," she whispered instinctively, because apologies are how the powerless keep rooms from breaking. "You don't have to be sorry," Ethan replied, and when he pulled a chair for her, the dining room reassembled itself around a new center. In another life, Richard would have made this a story about rules. He believed systems work because lines are not crossed. People need structure, he often told his managers. Consistency is kindness. But tonight, his structure revealed something else, a fear that kindness would make him look weak, that softening would erode the boundary between employer and employee until expectations slid into chaos. This was not simply snobbery, it was a calculus learned from years of guarding what he had built. He had trained himself to see exceptions as threats and mercy as a bad precedent. That's how mindsets grow roots, by turning isolated choices into a philosophy that feels bulletproof. He lifted his glass, then set it down again. He saw the guests witnessing him. He saw Ethan refusing to move. He saw Mary's jacket leaving a dark rectangle on the chair's fabric. Everything in him wanted to reassert control. Yet the smallest person in the room had already shifted the gravity. Mary sat with the caution of someone who knows that kindness can be revoked without notice. "I can stand," she offered, eyes lowered. "I don't want to trouble anyone." Her voice carried years of self-editing. She had cleaned houses where children had learned her name, but parents would not use it. She had felt the behind-the-scenes weight of wealth, the way doors swung easily for some and became walls for others. She knew families by their fingerprints on fridge handles, by the lone sock always lost behind a laundry cabinet, by the places dust always gathered because nobody thought to look. She knew Richard's family by the way he ate quickly, when tense, and slowly when winning, by the way Ethan left baseball cards in book stacks, by the way the dog's bowl always sat just to the left of the back doormat. "It's not trouble," Ethan said, and he meant it like a promise. Then, a beat later, softer, "Please." A gust moaned along the eaves, and the lights blinked just once, the way power reminds you it can vanish. The gas storm wanted to be part of the conversation. It drew everyone nearer to the table, as if to say that what happens in the glow of a chandelier matters little if it cannot stand up to the weather outside. Richard took a breath that sounded like a concession, but came out as a compromise. 5 minutes, he said into the room, as though speaking to the air rather than to Mary. It was a decision dressed like generosity, a calculated allowance meant to protect his image of fairness. He would have preferred applause from his guests, a nod, a murmur of agreement. Instead, he heard only the rain and the sound of his own thinking. He felt a question opening inside him like a door he hadn't known was there. When did he begin to believe that boundaries would collapse if he let humanity in? When did he decide that warmth was a currency he had to budget? Across the table, a woman in a navy dress adjusted her necklace and studied Richard with the alertness of someone who recognizes a story that will be repeated in other rooms. She had admired his ascent. She had not expected to witness this detour in his journey. If she were honest, she would admit the scene stirred something old, a memory of being 23 and told to know her place. Her eyes slid to Mary, then to Ethan, and she felt the tiny recalibration that happens when an assumption meets a new fact. This is the quiet way change begins, not in slogans, but in moments when an unquestioned habit loses its authority. Richard's mind flicked through memories like channels. The first deal he closed with nothing but nerve, the time an early investor called him kid, and he swallowed the insult and delivered the numbers anyway. The winter, his father's hands cracked from cold because the shop heater failed. Those images didn't soften him. He had never used hardship as a reason to be generous, but they did put pressure on the story he told himself about control. "I built this," he thought, and the sentence warmed him the way a coat does in November, but another sentence crowded it. "What am I building right now?" He glanced at Ethan, who held his ground without bravado. Leadership looked different in that small body, less about command, more about direction. The impact of that realization didn't explode so much as settle, an early snowfall you don't notice until the world has turned white. "Thank you, Ethan," Mary said quietly, and her voice trembled the way earth does under a passing truck. Not from fragility, but from accumulated weight. She pressed her hands together, not praying exactly, but aligning herself around a center that had kept her upright through many storms. In a corner of the room, a clock ticked the way time does when a decision becomes a hinge. Ethan smiled thinly and shifted closer to her chair like a bodyguard made of empathy. On a sideboard, the polished silver reflected them as silhouettes, a behind-the-scenes photograph of a new arrangement. The servant seated, the child standing, the master thinking. The dog padded in, nails clicking, and sniffed Mary's wet hem before settling at her feet without asking permission from anyone. Animals have a way of making decisions that cut through hierarchy. Richard's eyes flicked to the dog, then to Ethan. "We have guests," he said, almost as a plea. The sentence sounded to him like a lifeline to the old order, where public eyes enforced old rules. But the guests were not officers of his worldview. They were witnesses. And witnesses do something unpredictable when the hidden truth steps into the light. They revise their stories. You could feel the room writing a new one now, slowly, sentence by sentence, around the boy who had opened the door. Outside, the rain softened into a steadier rhythm, as if the storm had decided to listen. In the kitchen, someone lowered the stove flame, and the smell of rosemary pulled through the air like a memory of easier times. Mary took a breath that finally reached her lungs. "I'll wipe the floor after," she murmured, as if a promise to erase her own presence could make the moment safer for everyone. "You won't," Ethan answered, and a faint smile cracked his serious face. He pulled a napkin from the table and handed it to her with a small, formal gesture that turned courtesy into ceremony. It wasn't grand, but it was a revelation. Sometimes the smallest, most ordinary acts are the ones that shift the floor beneath our feet. Richard tapped his index finger against the table, an old habit, borrowed from countless meetings. He wanted to redirect the evening, but the evening had already redirected him. He heard himself ask, "Are you warm enough?" And the words surprised him the way a mirror surprises you when it catches you between expressions. Mary nodded. "Yes, sir." The "sir" landed with gentleness, not because she felt small, but because she had decided that grace would be her posture. She had learned long ago that dignity often looks like restraint. It was her superpower to absorb the impact without letting it define her. A car splashed along the street beyond the iron gates, faraway sirens braided into the rain. Somewhere in Chicago, or maybe Westchester or outside Seattle, in a neighborhood where lawns carry their own quiet rules, other dinners continued without interruption. Inside this house, however, 3 American lives recalibrated their orbits. Richard's confidence, long anchored to outcomes and optics, met a question mark he couldn't erase. Mary's habit of invisibility met light. Ethan's childish courage met a platform and discovered it had the strength to hold him. No announcements were made, no speeches delivered, and yet the room tilted. That is how transformation often works. Not as fireworks, but as a shift in gravity. "Dad," Ethan said after a silence that felt like a cleared stage, "we can make different choices." He didn't say mindset or leadership or culture, but he pointed to them without knowing. His words were a map. Richard looked at his son and saw a timeline branching, one where he doubled down on being right, another where he risked being better. Decisions like that arrive quietly and change the architecture of a life. The storm outside moved on, but the weather inside the room prepared to change too, because whatever came next would not be about policy or procedure. It would be about whether a man who conquered markets could face a mirror and recognize the person in it. And in the hush that followed, with rain beads still, clinging to Mary's sleeves and the chandelier humming softly overhead. The house seemed to lean in as if it, too, needed to know which story would be written from this point forward, and how each of them, Richard, Mary, and Ethan, would carry this night into the mornings that waited just beyond the door. The storm outside roared like an untamed orchestra, each gust of wind slamming against the glass panes as though demanding to be let in. Rain pounded the roof in relentless rhythm, cascading down, the gutters pooling on the driveway and spreading across the cobblestone path like a sheet of liquid glass. The night air was thick with cold, each droplet piercing skin like needles, the kind of rain that seeps past clothing and straight into the bones. Out there, standing just beyond the threshold of safety, was Mary, her hair plastered against her face, her jacket clinging heavily to her shoulders, her shoes squelching against the soaked pavement. She wrapped her arms around herself, not just for warmth, but for the thin comfort of feeling less exposed to the elements and to the humiliation she had been forced to endure. Inside, it was another world entirely. The mansion pulsed with warmth and order, a place where every detail was carefully arranged to signal power and stability. The dining hall gleamed with polished wood and soft golden light that dripped from a chandelier hanging like a crown above the long table. Crystal glasses caught the light with delicate flares. A bottle of aged wine sat uncorked at the center, its deep red catching the glow. A roast filled the air with rich aromas. Garlic, rosemary, a hint of pepper, comfort layered upon comfort, as though the meal itself had been designed to affirm security and abundance. The guests leaned back in upholstered chairs, their voices soft and satisfied, laughter circling the room like a rehearsed chorus. The storm outside was just background noise here, muffled by thick walls and thick pride. This was the contrast of the evening, so sharp it might as well have been carved with a blade. A house that represented safety and prosperity became the stage for rejection and exclusion. The cruel irony was impossible to ignore. Mary was the one who had helped prepare the very table that now excluded her, her hands the same that had polished the silverware and arranged the napkins. She had contributed to the warmth inside, yet was condemned to the cold outside. Have you ever noticed how injustice becomes clearest? Not in grand gestures, but in small, sharp contrasts. The glow of a chandelier is brightest when compared to the darkness just beyond the window, and here the injustice burned brighter than the candles lining the table. Mary's breaths came out in visible puffs, her body trembling from the chill that had already soaked through every layer she wore. She thought of knocking again, of asking once more for a place inside, but the sting of Richard's words held her frozen. She can wait outside until the storm passes. She works here. She's not family. It wasn't just the rain that left her numb. It was the weight of dismissal, the reminder that, in his eyes, her value began and ended with her labor. Behind the facade of wealth and sophistication, the hidden truth leaked out in moments like this. Compassion had no place at Richard's table. Inside, Richard's voice filled the room with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. He leaned back in his chair, glass in hand, telling a story about a recent deal, the kind of behind-the-scenes tale that impressed investors and entertained guests. His words moved easily, practiced and polished, a performance of power. But even as his voice carried, there was an undertone in the room that didn't quite align. Guests shifted, some glancing at the window, where the storm pressed insistently against the glass. They may not have admitted it out loud, but they knew, somewhere between sips of wine and bites of roast, that something was wrong. "Dad!" Ethan's voice was barely more than a whisper, but in that space of curated laughter and clinking cutlery, it carried like a bell. He leaned toward the window, eyes fixed on the blurred silhouette of Mary through the glass. "Why is Mary outside?" His tone wasn't rebellious. It was pure confusion, the kind only a child can hold. To him there was no logic in it. A storm raged, someone suffered, and the solution seemed obvious. Open the door. Richard waved his hand, dismissing the question as if it were an annoying fly. "She'll be fine, Ethan. She's used to it." Used to it. Those 3 words were heavy, layered with the hidden truth of how he saw her, how he saw all people who served him. To him, endurance was expected, compassion optional. Ethan frowned, his young mind wrestling with something that didn't make sense. "But she's cold," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Why can't she come in?" The contrast between father and son was striking. Richard, the product of ambition and hardened mindset, believed in distance and hierarchy. Ethan, untouched by such calculations, believed in humanity and proximity. And Mary, standing in the storm, represented the very test of which worldview held more weight. One defined by appearances and authority, or one defined by empathy and connection. The rain outside didn't ease. If anything, it seemed to strike harder against the walls of the mansion, as if echoing Ethan's unspoken plea. The sound was relentless. And for Mary, each drop was a reminder of her position in a world that often measured worth in wealth. Yet, within her shivering frame, there was resilience too. She had endured storms before, both literal and figurative. This wasn't the first time she had been reminded of her place, and part of her doubted it would be the last. But on this night, what she didn't know was that her quiet endurance would trigger a revelation, a shift in the balance of power within those golden walls. The dining hall glowed, insulated from the elements, yet a strange unease settled over it. Guests tried to continue their conversations, but the image of Mary outside lingered in their minds like a stubborn shadow. A woman in pearls tapped her glass but didn't take a sip. A man adjusted his cufflinks, though they didn't need adjusting. They all sensed the impact of the storm, not just on the windows, but on the fragile veil of dignity within the house. For all the laughter and warmth, there was a coldness deeper than any rainstorm lingering right there, seated at the head of the table. Ethan pressed his small hand against the glass, his breath fogging a circle on the window pane. His voice carried once more, this time steadier. "She shouldn't be out there, Dad. Not in this storm." Mary, seeing the blur of his hand through the glass, felt a flicker of warmth, not physical but emotional. It was the first time in hours that she felt seen, and in that flicker lay the seed of transformation, the kind of shift that begins not with grand speeches, but with a child's stubborn refusal to ignore suffering. The mansion, for all its grandeur, could no longer disguise the fracture at its core. The contrast had become unbearable. A woman who gave her labor and loyalty stood outside in misery, while a table of plenty pretended nothing was wrong. And at that very moment, as thunder rattled the walls and Ethan's hand stayed pressed against the window, the balance began to tip. What followed would expose more than Richard intended to hide, pulling truths from behind the curtain and placing them squarely in the light of his own home. The dining room had grown warmer, almost suffocating in its glow, as though the chandelier itself was trying to drown out the storm beyond the windows. Yet the tension in the air was heavier than the thunder outside. Mary stood on the porch, drenched and trembling, the rainwater dripping from her sleeves and running down onto the marble steps. The storm didn't ask who she was, or where she came from. It treated everyone the same, but Richard's words sliced through that fairness like a blade. "She can wait outside until the storm passes," he declared, his tone flat, almost casual, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than making a decision that cut into another human being's dignity. "She works here. She's not family." Those words landed with the sharpness of injustice. Guests who had been in mid-conversation paused, forks hovering above their plates, eyes darting between Richard and the boy at his side. Some shifted uncomfortably, hiding their unease behind glasses of wine. Others pretended not to notice at all, complicit in silence. But Ethan's face burned with disbelief. To him, it wasn't just a statement. It was a wound, delivered in front of everyone, as if Mary's worth could be reduced to a role, a paycheck, a title stripped of humanity. Mary's heart clenched at the sound of it. She had heard worse before, though rarely so openly. Years of service had trained her to swallow moments like this, to bow her head and tell herself it didn't matter, that survival required silence. She whispered almost instinctively, her voice barely carrying through the rain, "It's all right, I'll wait." But her trembling hands betrayed her words. She wasn't all right. The storm was merciless, the cold cutting, the humiliation unbearable. And yet she stayed where she was, the invisible line between family and help reinforced like a locked gate. Ethan couldn't contain himself, his small fists clenched against his sides, his voice rising louder than he intended. "Dad, she's freezing. Why can't she come in?" His eyes darted toward the window, where Mary's figure blurred behind the rain-splattered glass. His innocence didn't allow him to understand hierarchies or appearances. He only knew someone he cared for was suffering, and his father was choosing to ignore it. "She's done everything for us," he added, his voice trembling now. "She doesn't deserve this." Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head with a practiced impatience. "Ethan, you don't understand how the world works," he muttered. "If you blur the lines, you lose respect. This is not her place." His words carried the mindset of a man who had convinced himself that cruelty was a form of order, that keeping people in their place was how he preserved control. To him, this wasn't an act of malice, it was a decision rooted in the logic of power. But to those watching, it was heartlessness exposed in its rawest form. The storm outside seemed to protest louder, the wind rattling the windows as if nature itself rejected his verdict. Every crash of thunder mirrored the unease growing at the table. One of the guests, a woman in a pearl necklace, pressed her lips together as though holding back a protest. A man in a dark suit glanced toward the door, then quickly looked away, unwilling to be the first to speak against the host. The injustice hung in the room like smoke, choking but unacknowledged. Mary lowered her head, shame burning hotter than the cold, seeping through her clothes. She told herself she could endure it, that this storm would pass like all the others. Yet deep inside, a hidden truth stirred. Enduring was not the same as being respected. And while she was prepared to bear the rain, she was not prepared for the weight of Ethan's heartbreak at seeing her treated this way. His compassion made her feel both vulnerable and valued at once. "Dad, she's not just someone who works here," Ethan said, his voice louder now, his small frame trembling with conviction. "She's Mary. She takes care of us. She takes care of me." His words cracked the illusion of distance Richard had built, pulling the invisible wall into the open where everyone could see it for what it was. A barrier sustained not by necessity, but by pride. Richard's face hardened, the muscles in his jaw twitching. He wasn't used to being challenged, least of all by his own child. "Enough, Ethan," he snapped, his voice sharper now. "Sit down." But the boy stood his ground, his eyes glistening, his voice breaking as he whispered, "It's not right." And there it was, the collision of two worlds, father and son, arrogance and innocence. The injustice had been spoken, heard, and now resisted. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, some ashamed, others silently rooting for the boy's courage. What had started as a simple command now carried the weight of a revelation, that power without compassion exposes itself, and that sometimes the youngest voices carry the truest strength. The rain outside didn't ease, but inside the balance of the room had shifted. What Richard thought was control now revealed itself as cruelty. What he dismissed as order now looked like arrogance, and what he saw as defiance in his son was, to everyone else, a moment of clarity. This wasn't just about a maid waiting in the storm. It was about the hidden truth pressing itself into the light, the kind of truth no chandelier could disguise. The injustice was no longer a private decision. It had become public, written across the silence of the room, the whispers of the guests, and the trembling conviction of a child unwilling to accept what his father had normalized. And in that moment, as lightning lit the sky and Mary's figure remained on the threshold, the storm inside the mansion was only just beginning to build. The wind threaded itself through the eaves like a warning, a low, steady moan that made the crystal pendants on the chandelier tremble as if they, too, could feel the tension gathering. Ethan sat half-turned in his chair, one knee tucked up, pretending to listen as his father described a deal that sounded like a victory lap. But the storm kept calling him. Each gust against the window made him glance toward the foyer, where the glass panes wore a lacework of rain, and a darker shape seemed to waver and return, like a shadow breathing. He felt it before he understood it, the way children feel the truth under the noise of adult conversation. He slid off his chair as quietly as he could, the carpet taking his steps like a secret, and moved toward the hall, where the draft came through, and the air smelled like wet pavement and cold stone. He pressed his hand to the window and saw it clearly now. Mary's silhouette folded in on itself, shivering, one hand near her throat, as if she were reminding herself to keep breathing. "Dad, why is Mary outside in the storm? She's freezing." The words slipped out of him before he reached the door, as natural as an exhale. He didn't raise his voice, but the sentence reached the dining room with the clarity of a bell, and for a second, even the thunder seemed to pause to hear it. Richard's story trailed off on half a laugh, the kind that looks for agreement and finds none. A few guests stared at their plates, as if the pattern might offer a safe answer. One man coughed into his napkin, but Ethan was already turning the handle, the polished brass cold against his palm, and the door gave with a soft groan that seemed too small for such a big moment. The cold rushed in first, a clean, honest cold that didn't care about hierarchy. It moved past him like an accusation and folded into the warm air, dimming the room's glow by a fraction you could feel more than see. The smell of rosemary and butter was suddenly threaded with the sharp scent of rain and something metallic, the kind of smell that always comes with a hard wind. Mary stood just beyond the threshold, hair plastered to her cheeks, jacket heavy, water trickling off the hem to the stone like a string of beads. She lifted her eyes at the sound of the door and flinched, not because she was afraid of Ethan, but because hope can bruise when you've trained yourself to live without it. "Mary," Ethan said, voice steady now that the door stood open. "Come inside." It wasn't a command, and it wasn't a request. It was the simple logic of a heart not yet edited by status. He held the door with both hands, so the wind wouldn't shove it shut again. "Please," he added, not because it was required, but because politeness was his way of making space for her dignity to enter first. Behind him, chairs shifted on the floor, fabric rustled, and a knife tapped a plate by accident. The behind-the-scenes machinery of the evening, servers in soft-bottom shoes, the hum of the dishwasher, the timing of courses, stalled for an instant. You could feel the house hesitate, like a person about to say the thing they've swallowed for years. Richard took 2 steps into the hall, composed as ever, but his voice carried a sharp edge that turned warmth into warning. "Ethan," he said, the syllables clipped, "close the door." Ethan turned halfway and met his father's eyes, and if you looked closely, you could see how the boy's mindset had shifted in the space of a breath. This wasn't a tantrum, and it wasn't a dare. It was a choice, the kind you don't announce, but that reorganizes your entire sense of right and wrong. "She's freezing, Dad." He glanced back to Mary, who hugged her arms tighter, as if trying to become smaller. "She's shivering." Mary shook her head, the gesture a careful refusal meant to protect him from the consequences of his goodness. "It's all right," she said in a voice that almost dissolved into the rain. "I'm okay." It wasn't true, and they both knew it. But she wasn't arguing with the weather. She was negotiating with a history of decisions that had built the invisible wall she stood behind. She took a half step back into the downpour, trying to make it easier for him to do nothing. "Please don't," Ethan whispered, more to the moment than to her. He slid 1 foot forward, the slick floor testing his balance, and offered his hand. Children do that without thinking. They bridge the gap between worldviews with fingers and breath and presence. "Just for a minute," he said. "You can dry off. I'll get a towel." Richard's response was immediate, the reflex of a man who had spent a lifetime winning by responding faster than anyone else. Ethan. His warning rested on a foundation that had carried him from small-town scarcity to this chandeliered certainty. He had told himself for years that strong lines make safe houses, that blurred boundaries invite chaos. In his narrative, the hidden truth was simple. Power must be seen to be believed. But the room did not lean toward him now. It leaned toward the open door and the boy standing in it. The wind lifted a strand of Mary's hair, and for a second she looked like a figure on a shore debating whether to trust the boat. Inside was warmth, light, a chance to be human again. Inside was also risk, the eyes of people who might punish her tomorrow for stepping over tonight's line. She swallowed. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said. "You're not," Ethan answered, and there was something almost ceremonial in the way he said it, as if he were granting permission he shouldn't have needed to grant. He took another step, closing the last inch of uncertainty, and reached for the folded towel on the foyer bench, the one that always sat there for wet paws and muddy sneakers. He held it out to her. "Here." Mary accepted it with hands that shook from the temperature and from a lifetime of not being offered softness. "Thank you," she breathed, and the words fogged in the cold. She looked past Ethan to Richard, not begging, not accusing, simply acknowledging the gravity of moving forward without his blessing. The guests had drifted into the hall, drawn by the gravitational pull of something real. They stood in small clusters, their postures carefully neutral, but their eyes told the story, a quiet chorus of disbelief that this choice had to be a choice at all. A woman in a navy dress lifted her chin an inch, the micro-gesture of someone deciding which side of a moment to stand on. A man with a banker's smile found his tongue and then lost it. The script he used in boardrooms suddenly useless here. This was not a debate over valuations. It was the unveiling of a value. "Ethan," Richard said again, moving closer, each step precise, the way he approached podiums and hostile questions. "We have guests." The sentence carried three meanings. "You're embarrassing me, this is not the time, and the house has rules." He didn't raise his voice because he never had to. Authority radiated off him like a heat source. Ethan didn't move from the door. "Then they should see us do the right thing," he replied. He didn't say it to provoke. He said it as if reading a line written somewhere beneath the paint, the house's original wiring for decency that had been capped and hidden behind renovations of pride. The impact of that small sentence rippled outward, through Mary, who stood with the towel clenched in her fingers, through the guests, who felt their polite equilibrium tip, and through Richard himself, who blinked as if the light had changed. He could have ended it there with a wave, a bark, a command. He had ended harder things with less effort, but something in the boy's stillness, a mirror of the storm's persistence, made him hesitate. It was the kind of hesitation that lives at the start of a transformation. The pause where a person considers a different path and, for the first time, sees it as a choice rather than a loss. Behind the scenes of his certainty, memories moved. A mechanic's hands cracked by winter. A kitchen where the heat came from the oven because the radiator was dead. A boyhood lesson that the world doesn't give you anything you don't take. That lesson had served him in every room that mattered, until now, in the room that mattered most. 5 minutes, he said, measuring the words like he was pricing a compromise. He tried to send them to the whole house instead of to Mary, as if generosity could be an atmospheric condition rather than a human address. A few guests exhaled, relieved to have something they could interpret as mercy. But it wasn't mercy. It was a decision dressed to look like control, and everyone who knew the difference could feel the seam. Ethan didn't gloat. He simply stepped back just enough for Mary to cross the threshold. She did so with care, placing her weight on the inside foot as if the floor might reject it. The rain stayed outside, but a thin ribbon of water came in with her and made its way across the marble in slow, certain curves. Ethan closed the door gently, as if the house were older than it was and might bruise. "You can sit," he said, guiding her toward the bench. "I'll bring hot tea." He said it like a plan, not a favor. Mary sat, eyes lowered, shoulders shrinking out of habit. "You don't have to," she murmured. Her voice carried the endurance of someone who has mastered survival and tries not to ask the world for anything extra. "I want to," Ethan said. "I should have noticed sooner." The admission didn't accuse his father. It accused himself for the small delay between seeing and acting. For children, the journey from witness to helper is short, and he now understood he never wanted to leave that path. Richard watched the scene assemble itself without his input. He felt the couch of his authority sink an inch, not collapsing, but settling under a weight it was never built to hold. He could tell himself this was optics, that the impact would be contained if he framed it right later. He could also feel a different frame forming on its own. The hidden truth that rules without compassion become cages, and cages don't just trap the people outside, they harden the people inside. He didn't like the taste of that thought, but it lingered. In the kitchen, steam began to whisper from the kettle, the quietest herald of a shift. One of the servers, a woman with quick hands and eyes that missed nothing, appeared with a stack of towels, placing them on the console with care that made the gesture invisible to anyone who didn't know what care looks like. Ethan took one and handed it to Mary, then another for her lap. "I'm dripping all over your floor," she said, half apology, half humor, trying to lighten what she could not change. "It's just water," Ethan answered. "It'll dry." And in that easy acceptance lived an entire counter-argument to the order Richard had crafted, that not every mark is a stain, not every deviation a threat. Some traces are proof that people have been here, together, making better decisions than yesterday's. A murmur moved through the guests, subtle, like wind in high grass. You could feel opinions shifting, journeys recharted in the small spaces where people admit to themselves that they have seen something they cannot unsee. The room's temperature returned to normal, but its climate had changed. The weather inside no longer obeyed the old fronts of wealth and pride. Richard clasped his hands behind his back and looked at the closed door, at the wet umbrella leaning like a tired guard, at his son kneeling beside the bench to help Mary unwrap her scarf. He heard, beneath the hiss of the kettle and the slow drip of the coat, a sentence that had not been spoken yet, but would not go away. "There are moments when leadership is the courage to step out of the story you wrote for yourself." "Thank you," Mary said again, and this time it wasn't thin. It carried weight, not the weight of obligation, but of recognition, that she had been seen, that her presence had finally been allowed to count as human. Ethan nodded once, solemnly, as if sealing a small, necessary contract. The kettle clicked off. A door somewhere deeper in the house opened and closed, with the soft punctuation of a new paragraph beginning. The rain eased to a steadier rhythm that sounded almost like breathing, and in that steadying, with the towel warming her hands and the marble reclaiming its shine under the thin river of water, the next layer of the night edged into view, ready to show what would happen when a boy's quiet certainty met a father's practiced control and asked, without fanfare, to be taken seriously. The silence in the room was no longer comfortable. It was stretched, taut like a wire, humming with tension that no one dared to break. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, forks resting on the edge of their plates, eyes darting from Richard to Ethan to Mary, as if they had been invited into a drama they hadn't signed up for but could no longer ignore. The storm outside, still pressed against the windows, the rain a relentless percussion that seemed to punctuate every pause in the air. And in the center of it all stood Ethan, small in stature but impossible to overlook, his voice trembling yet clear. "Dad, she's freezing. Why won't you let her sit down?" His words rang with the stubbornness of innocence, not rebellion. They weren't coated with calculation or strategy. They were raw, honest, and impossible to dismiss. Richard's jaw clenched, his fingers tightening on the back of his chair until his knuckles whitened. He was a man used to being questioned in boardrooms, in negotiations, even in courtrooms, but never in his own home, and never by his own son. He drew a deep breath, forcing the steel back into his voice, and said, "Ethan, you don't understand. She's just the help. This isn't her place." The sentence fell heavy, colder than the storm outside, and the impact was immediate. Several guests shifted, some lowering their eyes, embarrassed by the blunt cruelty. Others tried to keep their faces neutral, unwilling to show disapproval for fear of offending the powerful man who sat at the head of the table. But no amount of silence could soften what had just been spoken aloud. The hidden truth was now visible. Richard's world was built on lines, on separations, on roles defined by power rather than humanity. Ethan's eyes widened, his small hands curling into fists at his sides. "She's not just the help," he said, his voice cracking, but rising, strong in its conviction. "She's Mary. She helps me with my homework when you're too busy. She makes me hot chocolate when I have bad dreams. She listens when I talk about school." His voice wavered, but he pushed forward, his chest heaving with emotion. "She's part of this house even if you don't see it, and she's not supposed to be out there in the storm." The boy's words cut deeper than any adult's argument could have. They weren't rehearsed, they weren't strategic, they were lived experience, spoken from a place of truth that stripped away every layer of Richard's justification. Guests glanced at each other, their expressions shifting from discomfort to something else. Recognition, even admiration for the child's courage. Richard tried to stand taller, to regain control, his voice dipping into the authority that had always commanded obedience. "Ethan, you're a child. You don't understand the way the world works. People have their place. Boundaries keep order." He gestured toward the table as if the polished silver and perfect arrangement of dishes were proof of his point. "If we let things blur, there's no respect left. That's how things fall apart." But Ethan didn't flinch. His small voice grew louder, fueled by the injustice he couldn't ignore. "Respect doesn't come from keeping people outside, Dad. Respect comes from treating them like they matter." He pointed toward Mary, who sat awkwardly on the bench, her wet clothes leaving a dark stain on the cushion. "She matters. She's been here for years, and you act like she's invisible, but she's not. Not to me." Mary lowered her head, tears mingling with raindrops on her cheeks. It wasn't the storm that broke her. It was the fact that for the first time in a long time, someone had spoken her name like it meant something. She whispered softly, almost as if trying to protect Ethan from the weight of his own courage, "Ethan, it's okay. Don't upset your father." But Ethan turned to her, shaking his head. "It's not okay, Mary. You shouldn't have to be out there. You shouldn't have to feel like you don't belong." His voice cracked again, but the determination behind it only grew stronger. Richard's face reddened, his polished calm beginning to unravel. He could feel the eyes of every guest on him, watching not as subordinates, but as witnesses, measuring the man not by his wealth, but by his decisions in this moment. He slammed his palm against the table, the sound sharp and jarring. "Enough! You don't get to tell me how to run my house." The chandelier swayed slightly from the force, crystals clinking together like fragile echoes. But Ethan didn't back down. He stood in the space between his father and Mary, his small frame like a barrier no storm could push aside. His voice shook, but he spoke louder than he ever had before. "Maybe it's not your house tonight, Dad. Maybe it's just a house with walls and lights. Because if you can't let someone in from the rain, what's the point of having all this?" He swept his arm toward the glittering dining room, the polished silver, the chandelier that sparkled like a crown. "What's the point if you can't even be kind?" The room went silent again. But this silence was different. It wasn't the silence of discomfort, it was the silence of revelation. Guests stared, some with their mouths slightly open, others with tears beginning to gather in their eyes. The weight of Ethan's words filled the air, undeniable and unshakable. The hidden truth had been spoken out loud by a child who refused to accept cruelty as normal. Richard stood frozen, his authority shaken, his carefully constructed image beginning to crumble under the weight of his son's innocence. For the first time, he looked less like a leader and more like a man exposed. His cruelty no longer disguised by wealth, his arrogance no longer protected by silence. And in that moment, as the storm outside softened to a steady patter, the confrontation had shifted the balance of the entire evening. The father who prided himself on control had been undone not by power or strategy, but by the voice of his own child. The boy's defiance hung in the air, not as rebellion, but as truth spoken too clearly to be ignored. And as Mary clutched the towel in her lap, her trembling hands pressed together as though trying to hold the moment still, the next chapter of this storm inside the mansion was already unfolding, pressing forward with the same inevitability as the rain that still whispered against the glass. The rain softened to a steady hush, a white noise that made the chandelier's glow feel almost fragile, as if light itself were listening. Ethan didn't wait for permission that never came. He guided Mary from the foyer with a gentle hand at her elbow, the way you steady someone you care about on ice. The towel he'd pressed into her palms was already damp along the edges, but he didn't seem to notice. All he saw was a person who needed warmth, and the shortest distance between need and kindness was action. He led her past the threshold where wet marble turned to polished wood, past the gilded mirror that had reflected so many curated evenings, and toward the table that had always been a border. The decision felt small in the body, a few steps, a pulled-out chair, but its impact traveled the room like a current. Conversations that had tried to resurrect themselves after the confrontation fell away again. The guests were no longer simply attending dinner. They were witnessing a shift in the house's gravity. "Sit here," Ethan said, his voice a little breathless from nerves and conviction. He pulled out a chair, not at the edge, not near a corner, but beside his own place at the table, inside the circle of warmth and food and eyes. "Please." The word landed like a seal on a document everyone had pretended didn't exist. Mary hesitated because survival teaches you to weigh every gesture for consequence, but the towel was warm against her hands, and the boy's sincerity left no foothold for doubt. She lowered herself to the chair with careful grace, the hem of her jacket drawing a glistening crescent on the floor, the storm's signature following her in like proof. Across the table, napkins were folded and refolded with sudden fascination. Glasses were adjusted by hands that didn't need adjusting. The clink of silver became a metronome for disbelief. What stunned them wasn't that kindness had appeared, but where it came from. Not from the host, who embodied success, not from the adults who knew all the rules of etiquette and charity, but from a child who bypassed justification altogether. The hidden truth made itself visible. Compassion doesn't ask the room for consensus. "I'm dripping on your chair," Mary said softly, as if her presence required apology. Her eyes flicked to Richard and back to the plate in front of her, a plate that held nothing, yet felt like it held permission. "It's a chair," Ethan said, with a small shrug that carried the weight of an uncomplicated mindset. "Chairs dry." He reached for a linen napkin and placed it on her lap, not as a servant would, not as a host performing a ritual, but as a friend doing something obvious. Steam curled from the teapot, the citrus blend the staff brewed when the weather turned mean. One of the servers materialized with the quiet expertise that makes difficult moments look orchestrated. She set a cup in front of Mary, then filled it carefully as if to avoid disturbing what had already been made fragile. The lemon rose through the air like a reminder that warmth has a scent. Mary wrapped her fingers around the cup and closed her eyes for half a second, the heat moving into her palms with the slow patience of relief. Richard stood at the head of the table, as if anchored there, posture perfect, jaw tight, a general out of step with the battle he thought he was commanding. He reached for the bottle of Cabernet and realized how absurd the gesture would look right. Now, as though normalcy were a trick he could perform on demand, he let his hand fall. The power he loved most, the ability to set the tone, had slipped. Not because he'd lost money or face in a public market, but because a 10-year-old had drawn a new line around what mattered. "Thank you," Mary said, looking not just at Ethan, but at the faces around her, asking and answering a question at once. "Can I sit here and still be myself? I'll clean up after, I promise." "You won't," Ethan replied, then softened his tone out of respect. "You won't need to." He shifted his chair closer, a quiet pledge to absorb whatever fallout might come. "Do you want honey? Grandma says honey makes the warmth go further." The sentence, so ordinary, made two of the guests smile without meaning to. They were reminded that care often sounds like small talk when it's busy saving someone. The contrast, laid bare all night, now sharpened to a point. Outside, the rain kept its steady percussion on the stone. Inside, the chandelier scattered patient light across a tableau that no planner could have scripted. A boy and a woman sitting shoulder to shoulder, sharing heat and space. A father calculating the cost of his next move. A room full of people seeing a revelation they'd tell later, as if they had always known its lesson. The moral didn't need narration. It lived in the arrangement of bodies and the realignment of expectations. Compassion can come from the youngest hearts, and when it does, the rest of the room is graded by how quickly it follows. Richard's eyes found Ethan's, and for a beat, the air between them felt like a bridge under inspection. He could still choose to retreat behind rules and rescue his pride. He could enforce distance with a sentence and remind the guests what order looked like in his house. Or he could do the harder thing, walk across what his son had built and admit that his previous decisions had been less about order and more about fear. The journey from control to care is short on paper and long in practice. He watched Ethan break a roll in half and place the larger piece on Mary's plate, as if this were any Tuesday, as if the simplest sharing were the most natural ceremony. "Dad," Ethan said, not confrontational now, not pleading, just present. "She's warming up." He offered his father a lifeline that didn't look like one. The sentence didn't accuse or corner. It invited. It left room for Richard to step in without losing himself, if he wanted to. Guests began to breathe again, and with breath came awareness. A woman who had grown up in a union household felt the old vocabulary stirring, dignity, respect, solidarity, and realized she'd missed the muscle of those words. A man whose first internship had been unpaid caught himself recalling the day his supervisor brought him a sandwich, the exact relief of being noticed. Quietly, without a vote or a moral toasting, the room's coordinates shifted toward empathy. Behind-the-scenes judgments rearranged. Themselves. Revelations rarely announce themselves. They simply refuse to be unseen. Mary sipped her tea and exhaled, and with that exhale, some of the shivering left her. "I'll be fine," she said, more to Ethan than to the table, offering him the reassurance she had spent her life manufacturing for others. "I just didn't expect the rain to turn so fast." She could have been talking about the weather or the night, and maybe she meant both. "It always turns fast," Ethan said, looking at the window. "But we can still do the right thing fast, too." His optimism didn't erase what had happened. It gave the room a way to move forward without pretending there hadn't been harm. That distinction matters. It's how genuine transformation begins. Richard cleared his throat, a small sound that tested whether he still owned the stage. He looked at Mary fully, possibly for the first time in weeks, not as a role but as a person who had a seat at his table and a cup in her hands. He saw details. That service had trained him to ignore. The rawness at her knuckles, the careful way she kept the towel from touching the wood, the tired grace of a woman who had learned to minimize her footprint in rooms that took her labor for granted. He felt a tightening under his sternum that he had once called annoyance and now recognized as something else, the early ache of empathy trying to grow in soil not used to it. "We can bring another sweater," he heard himself say to no one and everyone, and a server nodded and vanished. The line wasn't an apology, and it wasn't an order. It was a first, clumsy attempt at repair, the kind a man makes when he hasn't learned the language yet, but understands the intent. "Thank you," Mary said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that was not defiance. It was dignity. That difference sat heavy on the table. It made the chandelier's jewels look less like wealth and more like decoration. A guest near the end of the table lifted his glass, then thought better of it, as if toasting would trivialize what the evening had chosen to become. Instead, he set the glass down and cleared his plate toward Mary's seat, the way families do when someone joins late, an instinct signaling inclusion without fanfare. Another guest asked if she preferred tea stronger or lighter, then laughed softly at herself, embarrassed by the intimacy of the question and encouraged by the humanity of it. These small adjustments sent a message louder than any speech. The house's rules were being rewritten through repetition of ordinary kindness. "Is it okay if I sit here for a bit?" Mary asked Ethan, testing whether this was a moment or a permission that would hold. The question wasn't about the chair. It was about whether the line had truly moved. "It's okay," he said, with a seriousness older than his face. "It should have been okay all along." He didn't look at his father when he said it. He didn't have to. The sentence hovered in the space between them like a blueprint for a different kind of home. The sweater arrived, soft, grey, the kind of neutral comfort that doesn't ask for attention. Mary slid her arms into it and let her shoulders drop the fraction they could. The rain continued its steady rehearsal against the glass, a softer percussion now, as if the storm had accepted that it no longer dictated the room's tempo. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked into alignment with the new rhythm. Richard sat, finally, because leadership sometimes looks like choosing not to remain standing. He laid his hands flat on the table, as if grounding himself in the wood he'd chosen, and the moment he hadn't. The old script tugged at him. Explain, rationalize, regain. But the script sounded hollow against what everyone had already seen. Silence, for once, was the stronger move. He lifted his eyes and watched his son break another role, watched Mary cradle her cup, watched the guests adjust themselves around a new center as naturally as plants turned toward light. What had stunned them at first, kindness from a child, visible and unashamed, now began to feel like a standard. Not a performance, not pity, but a recalibration of what a room like this should do when a storm presses its face to the glass. People who had arrived certain of the host's status now found themselves measuring him against a boy's steady compass. The hidden truth had stepped into candlelight and asked a simple question. If wealth can't make room for a soaked woman at a warm table, what is it worth in a world that keeps changing? Mary took another sip, and her voice, steadier now, found a thread of humor that made the moment human instead of holy. "I hope your floor forgives me," she said, glancing at the faint, dark crescents near her chair. "It's forgiven," Ethan answered, with the definite kindness only a child can deliver without sounding performative. "And if it isn't, I'll mop it." It was a small promise, but it carried the architecture of a bigger one. He would clean up the traces of this choice, yes, but more than that, he was ready to live with the evidence that compassion had passed through. The dog, who had been patient under the bench, rested his chin on Mary's shoe, as if drawing a boundary around her that no one was allowed to cross. A candle sputtered and corrected itself. The server refilled water glasses like a conductor guiding a symphony back into tempo. No one announced anything, yet everyone understood that the night had pivoted. The mansion's story had acquired a new chapter not because of a dramatic rescue or a grand speech, but because a boy treated a woman as a neighbor and a guest in a moment when it would have been easier to keep her outside. And as the tea cooled to a comfortable warmth, and the storm's voice settled into something like a lullaby against the windows, the room prepared, without saying so, to see what would grow from a seed planted by small hands at a long table, how decisions made in the soft light of one evening might travel into morning and reshape the house that waited for whatever came next. The clinking of cutlery had stopped entirely. The grand dining room, once alive with polite laughter and rehearsed stories of investments and golf retreats, had turned into a stage where no one wanted to play their part anymore. What lingered instead was the sound of the storm outside, its rhythm pounding like a second heartbeat, to the scene unfolding within. Richard had always been the orchestrator of these evenings, the conductor who decided the tempo, who chose the stories worth telling, who managed the mood with the ease of someone who believed his authority was permanent. But tonight, something unexpected had broken through his arrangement, and the cracks were widening in real time. Guests leaned toward one another in hushed voices, their whispers slipping across the tablecloth like shadows. "Did you hear what he said?" one murmured, her pearl earrings catching the light as she turned. Another, more cautious, tilted his head down but couldn't resist. Imagine leaving her outside in that storm. The embarrassment was palpable, not just for Mary but for them too. People who prided themselves on being close to power, now watching the man they admired unravel under the soft, unrelenting truth spoken by his own child. Richard felt it. He was a man attuned to reputation, to the behind-the-scenes calculations of perception that made or broke fortunes. He could sense the tide shifting, even if no one declared it out loud. His authority, once ironclad, was fraying in front of the very people whose respect he had worked decades to earn. He looked down the table and saw expressions carefully masked, but not enough. A raised eyebrow, a tightened jaw, averted eyes. Small betrayals that revealed more than words ever could. "Ethan doesn't understand," Richard tried to explain, his voice attempting calm but sliding toward defense. "He's a child. Children see the world in simple lines. Life isn't that simple. There are places for everyone, and order depends on respecting those places." He was speaking to the guests as much as to his son, hoping to reclaim the narrative, to remind them of his supposed wisdom, but his words fell flat, like notes played out of tune. Ethan, still seated beside Mary, didn't look at his father when he answered. His eyes were on her trembling hands wrapped around the teacup. "Order doesn't mean leaving people in the rain," he said quietly, but every syllable carried weight. "Order doesn't mean deciding someone is less important because they work for you." His voice wasn't rehearsed, it was raw. A child's honesty cutting deeper than any speech an adult could craft. Guests exchanged glances, and the whispers turned to silence again, not out of respect for Richard, but out of discomfort for him. His authority wasn't being reinforced by the room's quiet, it was being dismantled by it. The hidden truth was undeniable now. All his wealth, all his prestige, all his curated evenings couldn't cover the fact that in the simplest test of humanity he had failed. Richard reached for his wineglass, his hand shaking slightly, betraying the steadiness he always projected. He hated the tremor, hated that they could see it. "This is my house," he said, but it sounded smaller than he intended, less like power and more like protest. "Then make it a good house," Ethan replied, finally meeting his father's gaze. His tone was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the strength of a moral compass uncorrupted by ego. It was a revelation for the room. The heir to this mansion had already grasped what its master had not, that wealth without compassion was hollow, and prestige without humanity was fragile. The guests felt the impact in their bones. Some looked at Mary with new eyes, seeing not the help, but a woman who had carried her dignity through the storm, her humility shining brighter than all the silver polished for the evening. Others studied Ethan, realizing they were in the presence of a moment they would recount later, perhaps to their children, perhaps to themselves in quiet reflection. The night a millionaire's authority collapsed, undone not by scandal or loss, but by the truth spoken at his own table. Richard tried once more to gather the fragments of his image. "You're embarrassing yourself, Ethan. You're embarrassing this family." The words came harsher than he intended, and he knew instantly they had cost him. Because the room's silence didn't protect him anymore. It judged him. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his small shoulders squared. "The only embarrassment," he said, his voice steady, "is pretending that money makes us better than other people." His words echoed in the chandeliered space, stripping away the last layers of pretense. No one dared clap, no one dared nod openly, but in the quiet shift of posture, In the way guests leaned back with thoughtful eyes, Richard's collapse was complete. His prestige had been built on the perception of strength, but strength without empathy had revealed itself as weakness. His authority crumbled not with a bang, but with the steady erosion of respect. Mary took another sip of tea, her hands steadier now. She didn't gloat, she didn't need to. Her very presence at the table was the lesson, the proof that dignity survives, even when denied. Ethan's small acts had elevated her, not in wealth, but in worth, and the room knew it. The transformation was visible, undeniable, impossible to reverse. Richard sat there, surrounded by wealth, his mansion glowing, his guests dressed in their finest, yet stripped of the one thing he valued most: control. He had become the object of whispers, the man undone by his own arrogance, exposed by his own child. The hidden truth was etched into every glance, every lowered voice, every flicker of shame across the faces of his guests. Wealth without humanity is worth nothing. And as the rain outside slowed to a gentler rhythm, as if the storm itself had delivered its verdict, the night carried forward with a new balance. Richard's empire hadn't collapsed in dollars or stock value, but in something more intimate, more devastating. The quiet recognition that in the eyes of everyone who mattered, his authority no longer commanded respect. And that recognition hung in the room like a verdict awaiting its next chapter, pressing each person present to wonder what would unfold when silence finally broke and someone dared to move. The chandelier above the table still glittered, but its light seemed dimmer, as if even it had grown embarrassed of what it had witnessed. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his fingers curled tight against the edge of the tablecloth. But his voice, the voice that had commanded boardrooms and bent negotiations to his will, failed him completely. He tried to speak, to explain, to remind the room who he was, but no words came. His throat tightened, not from anger this time, but from the weight of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: shame. He looked at Ethan, his son, the boy he often thought too soft, too sheltered, too unprepared for the so-called real world. Yet here, in front of everyone, Ethan had revealed a strength that didn't rely on money, titles, or influence. It was a strength rooted in compassion, the kind that exposed Richard's own power for what it was: fragile, conditional, dependent on appearances. For the first time, Richard saw his son, not as an extension of his legacy, but as a mirror, reflecting back the hidden truth he had spent decades avoiding. The room was silent, though not in his favor. The silence no longer belonged to him. It belonged to Ethan and Mary, to the act of kindness that had rewritten the night's story. Guests sat back in their chairs, some with softened expressions, others still processing the impact of what had just unfolded. No one interrupted. No one offered Richard a way out. They all knew the performance was over, and what remained was raw, unfiltered, undeniable. Ethan leaned closer to Mary, his small voice cutting through the hush like a steady flame. "You're safe here," he told her simply. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words carried more authority than anything Richard could have declared, and in that moment, Mary's shoulders dropped ever so slightly, the tension she'd been holding finally loosening, even as her hands still trembled around the teacup. Richard swallowed. Hard, his mind caught between two worlds. One was the world he had built, defined by status, order, and control. The other was the one Ethan had shown him in a matter of minutes, defined by empathy, dignity, and the kind of humanity no wealth could buy. He felt the collision like a storm inside him, a private confrontation that none of the guests could see but everyone could sense. His mindset, shaped by decades of believing that toughness equaled survival, suddenly seemed small when measured. Against his son's simple act of decency, he tried again to speak, but the words fractured on his tongue. What could he possibly say? That he had been wrong. That he, the man who prided himself on never bending, had been bent by the truth of a child. His silence was its own confession. It said what he couldn't, that his son's heart was purer than his wealth, and no amount of denial could erase it. Mary turned her head slightly, catching his gaze for the first time all evening. She didn't gloat. She didn't glare. Instead, she looked at him with a quiet dignity, as if to remind him that forgiveness was not out of reach, though it wasn't owed. That look pierced him deeper than anger ever could, because it left the choice entirely in his hands. She had endured, she had accepted humiliation, but in her eyes was something he hadn't expected: patience. Not the kind that excused him, but the kind that waited to see what he would do next. The guests, still silent, were waiting too. They weren't waiting for another speech or another defense. They were waiting for a decision, the kind of decision that would reveal whether Richard's exposure tonight would harden him further or open a crack wide enough for transformation to take root. Ethan broke the tension again, not with defiance but with tenderness. "Dad," he said softly, "it doesn't cost anything to be kind." It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a lesson rehearsed in school. It was truth distilled into its simplest form, spoken without agenda. Those words, coming from the boy he had dismissed as too young to understand, struck him harder than any critique from an equal ever had. Richard lowered his eyes to the table, staring at his own reflection in the polished silver knife beside his plate. For a man who had lived his life projecting confidence, it was jarring to see the doubt etched across his features, reflected back at him from a piece of steel meant only to cut food. He realized then that authority was not just something you held, it was something others allowed you to keep. And tonight, in this house, in front of these people, he had lost it. Not to a rival, not to a scandal, but to the voice of his child and the quiet dignity of the woman he had tried to dismiss. The journey ahead of him was unclear. He didn't know yet whether he could change, whether years of hardened decisions could be softened by this one night. But the seed had been planted, undeniable and alive. And like all seeds, it would grow in the silence, in the aftermath, in the places no one else could see. Mary finished her tea, her hands calmer now, and set the cup gently on its saucer. Ethan smiled at her, proud not of defying his father, but of doing what felt right. The guests began to shift again. Though their whispers were gone, they didn't need to whisper any more. The truth was already visible, etched into the air of the room, impossible to erase. Richard sat back, finally releasing his grip on the tablecloth, his hands trembling slightly. He had been exposed, stripped of the armor of wealth and status, left to face the simple reality that humanity had slipped from his grasp long before this storm. And yet, as he looked at his son and at Mary, he felt something stir, not comfort, not resolution, but the faint, undeniable beginning of change. The night carried on, but differently now. The storm outside had softened to a drizzle, and inside, the mansion felt less like a fortress and more like a place waiting to be rebuilt. Richard had no words left, but the silence spoke for him, a silence heavy with recognition, with consequence, and with the fragile possibility of redemption. And in that fragile possibility, in the seed of transformation planted not by wealth, but by compassion, the story pressed forward, ready to reveal what would happen when a man whose authority had crumbled was forced to decide whether he would rebuild with the same stones or with something entirely new. The room had fallen into a calm that was nothing like the atmosphere at the beginning of the evening. The storm outside had softened into a drizzle, a steady rhythm tapping against the tall windows, as if nature itself were sighing in relief. The chandelier still glowed, but no one admired it anymore. The real light had come from a boy's decision, from the way Ethan's voice had shifted the weight of the entire house without him even realizing the full impact of what he had done. Richard remained quiet, not because he had found peace, but because he was staring at the pieces of his pride scattered across the table. Mary sat straighter now, her hands warmer around the empty teacup, her shoulders no longer curled inward as if she needed to disappear. It was subtle, but it was there, the proof that dignity, when recognized, breathes life back into a person. Sometimes The narrator's voice threaded softly into the scene. It's the smallest voices that remind us of the greatest truths. Compassion doesn't need wealth. It needs courage. And wasn't that what had just unfolded here? Not a grand speech, not a carefully calculated gesture meant to impress a crowd, but the raw honesty of a child refusing to accept cruelty as normal. That was the hidden truth everyone had seen tonight, the one that would follow them home long after the last candle had been blown out. Have you ever witnessed a moment like that, when someone too young, too underestimated, becomes the one to say what no one else dared to? Those are the moments that shift us, that reveal the cracks in our own mindset, that force us to look in the mirror differently. And maybe, if you're honest with yourself, you've also been in Richard's position at some point, so focused on control, on appearances, on the behind-the-scenes calculations of how others see you, that you forget the simplest thing, humanity. We all have. But the lesson here is not about punishment. It's about revelation, about the chance to let a seed of transformation take root before it's too late. Stories like this linger because they point us back to something essential. They remind us that decisions aren't only made in courtrooms, boardrooms, or polished dining halls. They're made in the quiet, everyday moments when someone is left outside in the rain, and you choose whether to open the door. The impact of those choices doesn't vanish with the storm. It echoes in the people around you, in the lives touched by a single act of kindness, or by the absence of it. That's why what Ethan did mattered more than anything his father had built with contracts or titles, because compassion has a reach that money never will. And that's why I want to invite you, watching this now, to step into this story with me. If this moment stirred something in you, if you found yourself agreeing with Ethan or remembering a time when you wished someone had spoken up for you, then share it. Leave your voice in the comments below. Tell me if you've ever seen a hidden truth exposed like this, or if you've ever been the one to bring compassion into a room that had forgotten it. Your story might be the next one that makes someone else pause and reflect. If you felt the weight of this lesson, tap the like button. Not as routine, but as a way of saying that these stories matter, that empathy deserves space even in the coldest of rooms. And if you want to keep walking with me through stories like this, stories that hold up a mirror and plant seeds of transformation, then subscribe. Each time you return, you're not just watching, you're part of a community that believes courage belongs even to the smallest voices. Because at the end of the day, wealth without humanity fades into silence, but a single act of compassion can echo for years. And there is another story waiting, one that ties into this truth, one that continues the journey we've begun tonight. The path doesn't end here, it bends, leading us further into the revelations that come when pride is stripped away and only the courage to love remains. And if you made it this far with me, maybe this story spoke to something inside you too. If it did, let me know in the comments. Just write, "I'm with you until the end," so I know you felt the weight of this message all the way through. Your words help keep these conversations alive, and I'd love to read them. And while you're here, tap the like button. It's a small gesture, but it shows that stories like this still have a place, and it helps me keep bringing more of them to you. If you haven't yet, subscribe so you don't miss the next journey we'll take together. Speaking of which, there's a video right here that ties perfectly into what we've just lived through. Click it, and let's continue walking through these lessons side by side.